Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. The People's International Tribunal, 20 years on. The topic for today, and we have two guests to discuss with us this important topic 20 years later. And this is Nalani Minton, Director of Iki Au Pono at the School of Nursing, UH Mānoa. And she is also the Ele Pono for the Tribunal Comique at the UN Geneva, the Decade for Indigenous Peoples meetings. Thank you for coming. And we also have Tengan. He's Department Chair of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawai'i. Thank you for coming. So could you tell us first a little bit about your political activism? Maybe we can start with Tai and your research agenda and so forth that has to deal with the question of Kanaka Oiwi and things that happen in Hawaii politically, socially, economically, etc. We start with you, Tai, if you don't mind.
Mahalo, Ibrahim. Well, my own experience within, I guess, the areas of cultural and political activism in Hawaii started when I was still an undergraduate in college. I was at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and I had gone to college with a very deep and abiding interest in issues of Hawaiian identity. When I graduated from high school, it was 1993, and that obviously was the year of the tribunal, right? Koho'okolo Nui Kanaka Maoli. And also the Onipa'a March that had taken place downtown. So when I went to college, I was very interested, but I had not yet personally been involved. And unfortunately, I wasn't at the tribunal myself. And I feel I missed out on that opportunity, but thankfully we have it on video. So mahalo to Namaka Ka'aina for that. Some of the people that were on some of the segments, particularly in Maui, where I'm from, included Uncle Leslie Kuloloyo, Uncle Charles Maxwell, and Dana Naone Hall. And so when I was an undergraduate still, when I wanted to get involved, I was fortunate enough to have those individuals, leaders in the Hawaiian community in Maui, really take me under their wing, in particular with regards to issues dealing with our iwi kupuna, our ancestral remains and the bones of our ancestors, and issues dealing with repatriation, with burial sites protection. And so I got involved with some of the activities there in trying to repatriate the iwi and their moipu, those burial items and their possessions, returning them from museums, reburying them back into the Kula iwi, the birth sands, our native homelands, on Maui in particular. And that, along with other areas of addressing Hawaiian political and cultural and environmental rights, took up much of the time that I was working with them, and later to this day has served as my basis for the kinds of work I now do as a professor here, teaching on issues of Hawaiian identity, including those of gender and masculinity with Hawaiian men in the community, working with organizations that are continuing to seek to protect our rights as Kanaka Oiwi, as people of the bone. Some of that has involved work trying to address the problems at the State Historic Preservation Division. Others have dealt with water cases on Maui. A very recent one is dealing with the rights of our Kanaka Maoli prisoners, or pa'ahau. So all these areas, again, they were addressed very directly in the tribunal, and we continue to address them here and in the community.
Yeah, well, that's why we wanted to have someone like you who has been active for quite a while in those matters and see how the tribunal had impacted that kind of work. So thank you for coming. Thank you again. Nalani, could you tell us more about you in terms of activism and so forth, and your role in the tribunal, and we go from there.
Yes, I was raised by activists. My mother is Uncle Kekuni, or Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell's only sister, and she says kahiapo. So she was an activist in education, and my uncle was an activist first in medicine and health. And that radicalized him to be more active in political issues, because so many of the people that he treated and the issues that were connected to health were also connected to our land and alienation from land and the overthrow and lack of recovery from a very painful history. And so in his seeking to improve health and health care for not only Native Hawaiians but everyone in Hawaii, he began to look at a lot of the patterns of illnesses that people were having in much larger numbers than other people. And this led him to look at Native health issues, and there was a pattern there that a lot of Native people who have been colonized or whose lands have been alienated from men, who have experienced some form of genocide, like for us it was a huge population collapse, end up with a lot of the same kinds of patterns of disparities, like early mortality rates and overrepresented in all of the diseases, et cetera. So anyway, he became involved in writing the Native Hawaiian Healthcare Act with other activists like Dr. Emmett Aluli and Mililani Trask and Dr. Nalani Andrade. And he also met Kawaipuna Prajin, who had been sort of like a roving ambassador of Kanaka Maoli issues in the international arena, which was just building up towards indigenous rights. And Kawaipuna had the idea of holding a tribunal. And he came back and talked with Uncle Kekuni and a small group of people about it, saying that, you know, during after the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials, it became law that if a people are living under unjust laws, they have the right to create a tribunal and to invite international observers and human rights observers to attend that tribunal and to document it and take the information to the United Nations. Okay. So Kawaipuna passed away before he was able to do that, and Uncle Kekuni was very moved by his passion for what he had wanted to do, so he took up the organization. One of the things that's really fantastic about the tribunal organization is that it was a people's process. So over 500 people from 6 islands were involved in organizing the tribunal, and it was held on ancestral lands where there had been a lot of evictions at that time. So people were very passionate about not only the Aina, but all of the issues that were creating barriers to them on the different islands. And they hosted the tribunal. So it was one of the first tribunals in the Pacific, and one of the first for Pacific Islanders. And it was the first that was ever held on eviction sites. So people came and we camped, and all the international observers and the attorneys and the prosecutor advocates and the judges met with the people who fed them, and you know, in many cases we were in rural areas, and it was like a very intimate situation, but one in which the voice of the people rose again, and people who are not necessarily involved in formal political activism, but who are fighting for their rights and their lands and their families, were able to speak for themselves. So there's about 150 documents of testimony that were compiled, and this also was the first tribunal that was based upon Native law. So our cultural laws like the Kanawai were brought up, laws about water and laws about creating abundance and sharing and being Pono and making decisions and asking permission before you take from any natural area, and living according to ahupua'a systems where the families know very well their relationship with the Aina itself. So it was a really tremendous process, and I really recommend that people do watch the video of the tribunal. Uncle Kekuni was the convener, and so we all ended up going to the UN in Geneva and reporting on the tribunal and showing the tribunal video there. And I was designated by Uncle as the Elele Pono for the tribunal for that whole decade. So during that time, the tribunal became very influential in helping other indigenous peoples understand what was happening to a people who are not only an indigenous people and nation, but also a nation state, as the Kingdom of Hawaii was. One interesting thing that happened from the tribunal is that after the tribunal findings and recommendation were written and published, only 3 months later, that was from August 12th to the 21st, only 3 months later in November, the Public Law 103-150 came out, which is a joint resolution of the U.S. Congress acknowledging all of the same issues that were brought out in the tribunal. So there was a very direct effect in that sense. And the public law, or sometimes it's called the apology law, is a real law of Congress. It was signed by President Clinton. And it not only says that our self-determination was interrupted under international law and that we have the right to our sovereignty, but it expresses a concept that is very essential to all indigenous peoples, and that is it acknowledges us as inherently sovereign.
Right, yeah. So can I, just to show that we have the United States Public Law 103-150, and this is 103rd Congress Joint Resolution, number 19, November 23, 1993. And we have it, on screen so that it is like a real thing. I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned that it really acknowledges a lot of that which has been talked about in the People's International Tribunal. Yes. So that's very important. But let me do one thing first, and then we can continue. I interviewed Ula Hassiger. She's with Ethnic Studies, and she's the Director of Civic Engagement for the College of Social Sciences at UH Mānoa. And she gives us her perspective in terms of the tribunal, etc. And as you know, that she was very instrumental in the organization of that through her international connections. Yeah, right. Yeah. So we will show that segment, and then we can discuss it further.
Okay.
During the 70s and particularly 80s, there were a growing activism on the international front for indigenous rights issues, and Native Hawaiians were actually part of that from the beginning. Auntie Peggy Howe-Ross went to meetings in Geneva in the 70s, if I remember right. One of the most active people in the early 90s was Kawaipuna Prijin. And aside from going to Geneva with just $20 in his pocket to the human rights meetings, and bringing tons of materials home about indigenous issues worldwide, he also attended with Kekuni Blaisdell and others and a tribunal in San Francisco it was looking into the indigenous peoples and oppressed nations issues in the U.S. It was in October '92, and they were so inspired by that tribunal that was set up with people testifying to a panel of judges that Kawaipuna started working for having one in Hawaii at the 100th anniversary of the takeover. Unfortunately, he passed away in April '92. So when you see that this particular tribunal was a tribute to him, it was because it was he was the one that started it and started working on it.
Yeah, I just wanted to show that reinforces quite a bit of what you were saying, but she gives like some more detail. Yeah. For instance, Kawaipuna with $20 in his pocket, and so forth. But before we go any further, I'd like to go to the tribunal, the introduction from the Namaka Okaina video on that, and then we can see what the tribunal is all about in terms of visual, and then we can talk more about that.
For 12 days in August 1993, the United States and its subsidiaries were put on trial for crimes against us, the native people of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli.
Mahalo, mahalo, mahalo nakua.
panel of international judges was convened to hear the charges, which included genocide, ethnocide, the taking of our sovereign government, the illegal appropriation of our lands and resources, the destruction of our environment, and violations of international trust responsibilities.
Yeah, good. So I wanted to ask you, Tai. I mean, when you hear, when you hear Nalani talking about that ULA, and I know you have studied tribunal documents, some of them, and as an activist, how you look at it right now, seeing what we have seen in the Makauka segment?
Well, for me, it is something that fills me with a sense of tremendous pride and respect for those individuals who organized the tribunal, those who came out to give, as both Nalani, Ula, and others in the video mentioned, that collective voice to our lahui, to our people, who still today continue to struggle against many of those same forces, even as there have been important gains and ways of addressing them. So it's also that challenge for me and for others of my generation and for those of the younger generations to really step forward, carry on that important work, to hear those voices, to learn the lessons from that work, and to continue to build on it.
Yeah, good. I want to do one more thing. Go back to Ula, segment from Ula's interview, because she's reading a quote regarding the question of indigenous rights and so forth. So we do that, and then we go to you, Nalani, to expand more on your experiences and maybe commenting on all that which we have done so far in terms of visual.
That was in 1991 when he started working on it. He said, I think it's very important that people remember that what we are talking about as far as self-determination goes doesn't mean a parcel of land that they are going to give us like charity. This is our inherent right to sovereignty, our inherent right to govern ourselves in a manner we choose without interference. So People's international tribunals are a mechanism, an internationally recognized mechanism to give groups of people, indigenous peoples that are very often not nation states, a place to kind of try their grievances. They were also used for war crimes, for instance.
Yeah, so this is a quote from Kawaipuna Prajin talking about what it is that we are fighting for, meaning Kanakaʻiwi. So could you comment on those things and other things that you might want to discuss?
Yes, the term indigenous peoples is a term that the UN uses in a very specific way. And that's peoples who were swept with the land during colonialism, and also after wars, without any human rights, without any right of making a decision about their own destiny. And so the indigenous peoples movement that Ula was talking about was based upon the inherent sovereignty of indigenous peoples and nations who are naturally existing before the creation of colonial governments. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes they call themselves First Peoples or by our own names. So yes, indigenous peoples to some people means anywhere, indigenous means wherever you were born. But the UN uses indigenous peoples as a catch-all phrase because when you think about it, there are 7,000 languages on Earth, mm-hmm. and only 12 are the colonial languages. So all of those peoples and nations had a way of living, a system of living within each place that was appropriate to that place and which respected the laws, the natural laws of that place for thousands of years mm-hmm. Prior to colonialism. So as I was saying before, in the Public Law 103-150, it's very important that those words, inherent sovereignty, were used, were acknowledged. Because in that law, the United States, for the very first time, admits illegal actions and illegal actions of war also. In 4 pages, you learn the history of the overthrow of our government and all of the different aspects that the U.S. is admitting to. And then also the United States is saying that we have the right as Kanaka Maoli, as a people, as a culture, and as a nation to transfer our lands and our culture in the way that we seem that's appropriate to us. And so even though Indigenous peoples aren't all known by our own languages and names and histories and economies and, you know, all of the practices that we have, yet we have been grouped into a group of people who now have had a decade at the UN and who since that decade have formed a permanent forum at the UN in New York where there's reporting going on every year. And it's important to realize that as Kanaka Maoli, we do have a lot of responsibility for other Indigenous peoples because we do straddle that the two identities as a pre-existing nation, pre-existing to colonialism with our own laws, and also as a nation state during the kingdom law. So a lot of times in what I'm saying formal activism, I don't mean that as any kind of a hierarchical thing, but people who, let's say, are looking into kingdom law, or people who are researching different aspects of our history, sometimes don't go back to the 2,000 years prior to the last 500. The last 500 years where more has been written down is important, but we were an oral tradition people before that time. And collective rights means that you're rebuilding collective consciousness. And collective consciousness has to also come from the traditions and practices that come throughout time and are handed down from person to person, as well as those that are more modeled during the time periods where people were trying to adjust to a colonial identity. So it's important, the tribunal was important as a people's process. We gave a kahea for the Ku'e petitions because we knew that there had been these monster petitions that had been turned into the US government when the Queen went to Washington, D.C. for 3 years to try to right the situation and have the overthrow overturned and have the nation reinstated. And during that time, the people were organized on every single island to write, sign their names to a petition against annexation in any state or form. So there again, you have historically a collective voice of the inherent sovereignty of the people. And we have to remember that people have stood up for us, and we have to stand up for the next generations also.
Yeah.
And we can recover enough from the intergenerational trauma of a huge population collapse from almost 1 million people to only 20,000 in the 1920s. The 1920s is when Prince Kuhio went before the U.S. Congress and asked for return of lands for Kanaka Maoli to live on because there were only 20,000 left and he was afraid that we would become extinct. And that's when Hawaiian Homelands was created. But we have to realize that there's a difference between rights to self-determination as are determined by international law and rights of self-determination, which are determined from our own inherent sovereignty.
This is actually is critical to show, and also the relationship between the two, because then you can use that as a forum, in the UN as a forum to push for rights, for inherent rights of Kanaka Wai'iwi. I want to go to the tribunal segment where Kekuni Blaisdell, who was the convener of the Kaho'okolo Nui Kanaka Maoli, and he talks about a few things for about 1.5 minutes.
Great.
The existing establishment, the governments, refuse to move to correct the wrongs against us. No, Leila. Therefore, the people are compelled to organize and convene a tribunal, Ho'okolo Nui, the People's International Tribunal.
After convening for 2 days in Honolulu, the tribunal moved on to our island of Maui, where it was welcomed with ancient chants echoing off the walls of Iao Valley, where it heard our pleas to save our ancestral burial grounds of Waihe'e, where the prayers of those of us occupying our lands at Kahikinui were caught up in the swirling winds from Haleakala. On Molokai, as a hurricane threatened and then passed by our islands, the tribunal heard of efforts to retain our traditional way of life and restore our government. Beneath the United Nations flag on Kauai, the tribunal was treated to the hospitality of our people who face arrest and eviction daily and who fight to save our island from the ravages of Star Wars testing.
Star Wars testing. I remember Reagan time and so forth. It's fascinating. But you mentioned, Nalani, about like the duration of the tribunal, like August 12th to the 21st, and these are important dates, it seems to me. So what I want to do before we open it up, I want to go to Ula Hasager, a segment from there, and she talks about the importance of those dates, what the significance of those two dates, and why they were done in that and on those dates and in that year, 1993.
So work started already in 1991, and it was eventually decided to use the time frame between August 12 and August 21. The August 12 signifying the day when Hawaii was annexed in 1898, August 21st, the statehood day, the day Hawaii became a state in 1959. So that's why those dates were significant. In an international context, 1993 was by the United Nations declared the Year of the Indigenous Peoples. It was actually launching the first decade of the indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so, well, how does that grab you, Ty? I mean, you know, these dates, I mean, it's to me it was interesting, like 12th, 21st, you know, August, yeah. So, well, to you, like, you know, as an educator, the significance of, you know, those kinds of, say, dates, those kinds of, like indicators, yeah, milestones, what have you. So how does that grab you? I mean, in terms, what would you tell your students about significant dates, as an example, not necessarily those ones, but others?
Sure. One of the things that I try to impress upon my students and others who I speak to is anytime we have these real significant moments of commemoration, of remembering, we want to think about what that means to remember, right? And I like to say RE-member when I talk about that kind of memory work, which is to say it's both recalling these mo'olelo, these stories and these histories, but also bringing back the members of a collective group in that act of commemorating and retelling these stories, reconnecting with them. And so moments such as, again, my senior year in high school, January 17, right, remembering and also protesting the illegal overthrow. And then these dates too, right, looking at and not only remembering but also contesting as the people themselves come together to give testimony the illegal annexation, illegal statehood. I wanted to go back to when Nalani had mentioned the Ku'e petitions, right, of 1898. You know, I think this is one of the ways that we see some of the growth that has come since 1993 in important ways. In 1993, there hadn't been that same kind of real public awareness and consciousness of the Ku'e petitions, but because of the work that people like Nalani and Noinoi Silva did, these were brought back out into the community. And so in August, again, of 1998, right, this would have been, 5 years after the tribunal, there was another important act of remembering where the petitions, along with some of our important sacred cultural objects, such as the Ke'eo Liloa, the sash of Liloa, were brought out along with a massive protest march that went downtown and to Iolani Palace, which was to protest the illegal annexation and to, again, remember these names, reconnect with those moments in history to make them real for us so that, again, our children and our grandchildren could then carry on that legacy of Ku'e, but also of reconnecting with this mo'olelo. So that's the issue of significant dates is really important, and it's one to think about.
Yeah, great.
I'd like to say something about that too. The protest against annexation was also important in terms of U.S. history, because U.S. history at that point was having to grapple with whether to become an empire or not. And so in 1898, 9 island nations were annexed by the United States for sugar. And it's one of those times where, like, we're used to thinking of the G8 coming together as the superpowers of the world and making a lot of the policy decisions that everybody else is going to be living with. But at that time, the U.S. was just entering the level of trying to build an empire and become a superpower in the world. And at that time, sovereignty and independence and self-determination all meant the same thing. They were all the domain of independent nations.
That's an important point, yeah.
At that time, we were an independent nation as the Kingdom of Hawaii with treaties of our own, nation to nation. So we have to remember that the sort of degrading of rights of self-determination to be less than from an independent status has happened after colonialism. And that there are still independent nations that are small island nations that exist in the world and exist in our Pacific. And that right now Tahiti and West Papua have decided to re-enlist on the decolonization, UN decolonization process. And a lot of it was from Uncle Kekuni's research. That he wanted to look into what are the real human rights of people that aren't being applied to indigenous peoples. And that was the work of the UN Decade for Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Rights in Geneva, was to have working groups where about 800 representatives of indigenous peoples all over the world came together and reported on the history of genocide in their experience, the history of the taking over of their lands, their health history, the condition of their water supplies, everything like that. So you got more of a global understanding of the effects of colonialism on a more massive level, and then what needs to happen in order to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. And so there was the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was drafted during that decade to include the different areas and regions of the world that are inhabited by First Peoples, and it's not a perfect document, but one of the first things that it establishes is that all peoples, including indigenous peoples, have the right to self-determination.
Yeah, I think this is a critical point. Thank you for bringing it up. So I want to go back to the tribunal from Namaka Okaina segment because we're talking about the judges. So here are the judges, and then we can talk more about it.
This group of individuals assembled here before you are individuals that have committed themselves over time to struggles for change in the world. And they have come here to struggle for change here on these islands.
And we are honored to have 9 distinguished champions of human rights to serve as our judges. Hyun Kung Chung, Professor of Theology. Professor of Theology at Ewa University in Korea and who has just completed a visiting professorship at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Lennox Hines, Professor of Law at Rutgers University. A member of the Creek Nation on Turtle Island, which Westerners call North America, is Professor Ward Churchill from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Professor Oda Makoto, distinguished novelist and peace activist, most recently visiting professor at State University of New York in Stony Brook. Coming all the way from Amman, Jordan, in the Middle East, Asma Khader, an attorney and champion of the Palestinian people there. Professor Richard Falk, Professor of International Law at Princeton University in New Jersey. Milner Ball is also a distinguished attorney and professor of constitutional law at the University of Georgia. From the Cree Nation, which the Westerners call Canada, is Sharon Venny. And all the way from Aotearoa, which the foreigners call New Zealand, is our brother Maori, Te Moananui Jackson. Heading the prosecutor advocate team is Glenn Morris of the Shawnee Nation, professor at the University of Colorado in Denver. And next to him, a citizen of the Puerto Rican Nation, is Jose Morin of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. And on Jose's left is our own Maivan Klek Lam, professor of law in her own right at City University of New York.
Yeah, like even I was at the tribunal a lot of it, especially on Oahu, and I watch it now. It's really fascinating.
I just want to mention that Maivan helped to organize the inviting of the different judges and prosecutor advocates.
Yeah.
We're really grateful to her.
Yeah, so no, thanks. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, the significations of dates, of events, and so forth. So to me, like watching it now, it's a huge signifier. Developed my own activism, etc. And now I'm looking at this like a renewal of that activism in terms of signification. So signifiers are very important, whether dates or events, because they give new generations, as we have talked about, a lot of stuff to think about and maybe emulate and be guided by. So I want to go to another segment from interview with Ula to say something about the tribunal, how different it was here than other tribunals. And of course, you have the same idea.
Usually in tribunals, you would have people come to the judges and testify. In this particular case, it was decided to do it the other way. Among other reasons, because Hawaii are islands, right? It's would be difficult to get outer island people to come to Oahu to testify. But also to make a stronger indigenous statement, trying to take this Western concept of a tribunal and make it Native Hawaiian. So the group of judges and media folks and organizers and international representatives, of which I was one, was traveling from island to island, and that was a logistic nightmare, but the outcome was really good.
Yeah, any more comments on that, Nalani?
Well, Ula played a very important role, not only as a young anthropologist who wrote Return to Nationhood, which includes many chapters that
which is right here.
Yeah, that different Kanaka Maoli wrote, and as Tai was saying, he was influenced also by reading that book. But she also worked with IVGIA, and IVGIA is an NGO that was very important in helping to organize and raise funds for people to travel to the UN in Geneva so that it would be a meaningful process represented by as many people as possible in the world. When we first got there, a lot of people were speaking more about the genocide effects of genocide and colonialism. But by the time we left 10 years later, people were talking about the wisdom of their cultures and how that was becoming part of law. I'll give one example. The Inuit people had done an assessment of their land according to their natural laws. So all the areas where fish breed, where fish migrate, where every form of life lives and has its own natural ecosystem. And then they created laws that only allowed visitors to come to certain areas and not the areas that would spoil or interrupt the natural order of life. And there were many examples of things like that that came out of the interchange of ideas and problems and solutions and timeless knowledge from indigenous people speaking to each other, where we believe that the earth is our spiritual mother. And so now Mother Earth laws have evolved out of the different conferences that affect climate change and the rising of the oceans. In our own Pacific region, we have many people who are looking for new homelands because the oceans are rising. So these natural laws are very, very important. And the tribunal did bring into play our own laws, our cultural laws, as well as looking at international law. So when you were talking about how we understand rights of self-determination, those rights that we must bring forward and identify and live by, like the Ahupua'a systems, the Kanawai, and also those that will help us globally, perhaps, because of the collective thinking of indigenous peoples, indigenous rights, and human rights. But it's a real blend and a mixture.
Right.
And it helps us evolve.
Yeah, okay, that's very good. What I want to do before I run out of time is talk about the verdict of the tribunal.
Okay.
We'll watch a segment of that and then probably we'll comment on it. We would have time to do so. The verdict is very important because there were charges and there were also findings, right? Recognitions and findings, etc. And a lot of people testified. But we're not going to have the time to do all that, unfortunately. This would call for another program on that, actually, because it's really important as a signifier. But we'll go to the verdict.
But as we went in our travels, we saw everywhere rainbows, a sign of peace. We only see half of the circle that rainbow makes. And as we went around the islands, we, in our own way, completed that circle with the colorful leis that were placed around our necks, and with the circles that we made each evening, the many colors in a circle completing the rainbow and the peace that we don't see completely yet. And the memory of it will remain with me always.
The sovereignty and self-determination of the Kanaka Maoli does not come from the Hawaii Homes Commission. It does not come from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. The sovereignty of the Kanaka Maoli Nation does not come from the United States Department of Interior, nor does it come from an appointed Hawaiian Sovereignty Commission. Kanaka Maoli sovereignty and self-determination flows from the Maka'ainana, literally the eyes of the land, from the people. It can only be relinquished by the people voluntarily, which the Kanaka Maoli have never done. Of this there can be no doubt. The United States and the state of Hawaii are guilty. They're guilty, their agents are guilty, their subordinate sovereignties are guilty. And now we ask that you bring your collective wisdom and sense of justice and moral authority to bear for the attainment of justice in this case.
Recommendations. The tribunal recommends the following. 1, that the United States government and the world recognize the sovereignty and right to self-determination of the Kanaka Maoli people under the provisions of international law. Kanaka Māori lands, including all ceded lands, Hawaiian homelands, and all other lands to which they feel they have a claim, should be returned to the control of the Kanaka Māori people without delay.
Yeah, so we have time to comment on the verdict. So, anything?
Yeah, there's a lot of contradictions in law, and now that the United States has admitted illegal actions under international law, you don't relinquish your sovereignty through the illegal actions of an occupying force. So there are a lot of things that need to be added up in a different way and understood and fought for in a different way. That saying that the truth will set you free or the truth will help you heal is part of what Uncle Kekuni had in mind in creating the tribunal, that people would hear the truth, would speak the truth, would know the truth, and that would help to empower them to research their own understandings. And we have to also contrast the laws of market economy and capitalism with the indigenous laws. The American laws are based a lot on possession, on profit incentive, and on precedence. And possession is 9/10 of the law. So one of the things that Moana was speaking about is that all the lands that are held in trust, the fact that there are native tenants' rights so that people who go to purchase real estate have to do a title search. The Hawaiian homelands, the conservation lands, the 5F lands, the military lands, about a quarter of our lands are taken over for military training by the U.S. Those all constitute lands. Our trust lands, the Kamehameha Schools lands, 50 intact ahupua'a. If we were to really look into what we possess, not claims, but what we still possess as a people, it would give us a different unifying level to come from in terms of our aina. Because people have been doing research also on their genealogy. The Ku'e petitions show us where people were in 1898 because they signed according to the ahupua'a and the island where they lived. So there's a lot that could be put together for us to look at what do we already possess as a nation of peoples. And we have to of course, recover from the intergenerational trauma of what's happened, but I think the generations that now have survived that and that people have put so much into researching to try to help them move things forward, who know the technology better, who are able to create new processes and new ways of representing ourselves. We need to have those discussions so that it becomes common knowledge, because common knowledge is common intelligence. And when you know something all at the same time, you get that quantum leap effect of critical mass. And it's something that as part of our own self-determination, we need to work on. All of us who are educators are doing that. All of those in hula halau are doing that, in the lua arts, in hokulea. People are bringing back the culture and teaching it again. But we need to connect everything so that we're unified as a people and a nation, not because we've been standardized as to who we are, but because we have a new identity, because we have survived. And Queen Liliuokalani said, don't fear trying to make things right again because you fear you may fail, because the voice of the people is the voice of God. And I think what she was talking about is that when we're connected with our aina again in a way that the aina rises up in us and gives us a voice to speak from, that's not just an opinion, but that comes from our relationship to all natural forms of life as family, then what we're speaking from is we believe in the kino lau. We believe that our ancestors never leave Hawaii because their love is so deep. And so they're here for us. But once we connect up with those spiritual forces, then we're more enlightened by the thoughts that we have and the actions that we take that will be pono and that will create the e mau ke ea o ka aina ka pono. That the life and the breath and the spirit and the sovereignty of the land is protected by the right intentions and the right actions of the people ourselves.
Yeah. Tai, your take on this and hearing the verdict?
Well, the kind of taking off of what Nalani was saying about the ways in which law, as a broad political and cultural force, can be taken in many directions, sometimes away from what's really the most important kind of basis of who we are, which is those spiritual, cultural values and foundations that make us a people. For me, my own, again, personal involvement, and it was noted, or kind of connecting with what was noted in the introduction when they showed the tribunal going to Maui and at Waihe'e, right, and talking about the burials there that were being threatened by a golf course, which at the time in '93 they were really in the middle of that struggle, and since then, fortunately, we're successful in stopping that golf course from being built, and today there's a trust there to maintain that as a natural and cultural preserve. But the foundation of that spiritual sense of who we are is very much in our bones. If we're talking about inherent sovereignty, what's in us, literally, materially, what the core of who we are is our bones, our iwi. That's why one of our own terms for identity is kanaka o iwi, where iwi, the bones, are the center of who we are. And it's because our iwi is the final resting place of our mana, of our spiritual power. And when our iwi are planted into the earth, right, that returns that mana to the aina. Just as we are being raised by that land that feeds us, we are receiving that mana, which, as Nalani said, comes out in the collective voice when we speak up. In cases such as burial sites protections, where in Waihe'e they were struggling, that's really literally was my backyard. I lived in Waiahu, and
You're a Maui boy.
I lived just like a mile away from that area, and hadn't known about that at the time when that was happening, but later getting to work with people, and particularly Dana Naone Hall really was my most important mentor, her along with Uncle Charlie and Uncle Les. Understanding that, as Dana puts it, if our iwi, our burial sites, are protected and in our own homeland, then we ourselves have a home, and each burial place constitutes sovereign ground, and it's really there that we have those connections. And that experience from her work, as well as others at Honokahua, at Waihe'e, other places on Maui, led to the creation of historic preservation and burial laws in 1990 that for the first time enabled legal protections for our unmarked burial sites. But when I started looking further back in some of the research, even at the time where all these new laws were being articulated during the kingdom, particularly land laws, one of the things that was pointed out by the historian Kamakawa is that, in the midst of all these different rights that were being discussed for land, the Kanaka Oiwi, the Kanaka Maoli, the indigenous people always had rights to their burial sites, no matter what chief had claims and mana over a site. A family could not be prevented from returning to those burial sites, and that was a testament to that firm kuleana, that kuleana pa'a of the maka'ainana of every family. And again, it reminds us that these are our sovereign places, and it's when we understand the values behind that Nalani mentioned, then we ourselves can exercise that inherent sovereignty.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention one other thing. John Ka'imikawa was one of the kupuna with the tribunal who helped to create the spiritual and cultural ceremonies on each island, and his halau dance for them. But I'm a filmmaker, and I made a film with him about the knowledge of Moloka'i, and that came from the family, the E family. And a lot of what he talks about is beyond democracy, because our cultural laws were laws in which every area of cultural life was represented and every family was represented in the decision-making process. And so the eyes of the land were the people themselves coming together and bringing up the conditions, the issues, the problems that need to be solved, how much taro had to be planted and how long it takes to grow and how they were going to transport it. the building of the fish ponds by bringing the puhaku over from a distant valley on the other side of the island. All these tremendous things were done in a collective force of people who were living in order to think of what everyone needed to survive and have everyone represented in the decision that they would all live with. And when I was in Tahiti on Hokulea, I met people from Rapa'iti. They had the same form of government at that, in thousands of years ago, when people were living as family systems. So I think it's really important that we learn from our kupuna and understand that a lot of the knowledge that is passed from family to family or within different cultural areas is not always written down, but it contains the wisdom of the ages, of the pattern recognition of thousands of years. And that's one of the things that indigenous peoples bring to an understanding of law or anything else, is that we have sacred responsibilities. And our laws are about sacred rights, like protecting the water, and making that be available for all people, because that's what sustains life.
Yeah. I want to emphasize a few things, like, for instance, the question of the bones, the Iwi you talk about. It's interesting, like in all indigenous cultures, but also in other societies that may not be thought of as indigenous, the bones of the ancestors are very important. That's why you don't desecrate, burial grounds and all that. One example, like in Jerusalem, there was this burial ground, a cemetery of Arabs who are indigenous, Palestinians, indigenous, and the state of Israel wanted to build like a museum on it, desecrating the bones, etc. There was a whole big riot, and a lot of opposition to that, and then they just went ahead and, trying to do this kind of desecration, etc. So I wanted to point out how important that particular thing is for indigenous population. But the other thing is that, and we have touched upon that, and we still have 1 minute left. I want to say that, in fact, what we need to think about, and I would like to see your opinions within 20 seconds, perhaps, or so, about where do we go from here, although we have touched upon it. Where do we go from here, and what needs to be done in terms of a strategy? And then Ty.
Okay, well, I want to speak in honor of my uncle, Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell, because I feel like he is an example of a person who helped to coalesce people. He has such a love of people that he brought people together, and through their trust and love of him and through his looking out for them, his malama for them, he introduced the concept of ku'oko'a again, so that no matter what process we go through, whether they're international law or our own laws or whatever processes, we need to be very intelligent about what we do at this period of time and create a process in which we can assess how we need to come together.
In a few words before we wrap it up, Ty, please.
One of the important Hawaiian sayings is "Olana iwi," the bones live, and it's really speaking about the ways in which it's the responsibility that kuleana, again, as well as the right of the mo'opuna, the grandchild, to care for the ancestors, and we are those who make our ancestors' bones live.
Well, thank you very much. We're flat out of time, and thank you very much for coming, and see you next year. Aloha.
Aloha.